So, welcome everyone. This is exciting for me. My name is Rob Eddy. I'm the Resource Efficiency Horticulturalist for RII. As you probably know about us. We are a nonprofit public-private partnership that promotes the CEA industry and particularly resource use efficiency. I'm glad to be here today because this is about floriculture. Floriculture trends and insights from the USDA Agricultural Census. We'll tell you all about what that means. I'm a floriculturist. I have a master's degree in floriculture from Purdue University. A lot of my career has been immersed in this industry, so it's been a delight to take this project on with Carmen. I just want to say a couple things first as we get started, that floriculture, we are as a species, we're attracted and connected to flowers. Flowers are perhaps our first way of recognizing different plants for medicinal uses. And today, over 30% of our pharmaceuticals are derived from plants. As a species, we were using plants in burials 62,000 years ago, Neanderthals, and weddings at least 3,000 years ago, it's been documented. So flowers have been with us, close to us all this time for celebrations, holidays, gifts, get wells, community aesthetics, our own home decor. But for the CEA industry in particular, floriculture has driven advancement in greenhouse production. We owe a debt to the sector of CEA. The substrates we use, the greenhouses, the design and management of those facilities, lighting, water-soluble fertilizers and injectors, photoperiodism and how to control flowering of poinsettias and chrysanthemums, and yes, cannabis with black cloths, IPM for better pest control. And all these solutions usually were at a very, very cost effective because the margins are slim in the floriculture industry. So we could always use this kind of common sense, down to earth solutions that this industry has provided. Floriculture has driven research and trained growers. Now, there's been sort of an interesting correlation here with what has been happening in the industry. This is my opinion. Other people may disagree. The industry stagnated in the 2000s, setting off a chain of events. Those big retailers started selling plants, and then that put a lot of retail greenhouses out of business. So business dropped off, wages got lower. There wasn't equipment investment like there could have been to make the working conditions better. So people didn't want to do the jobs, and that affected enrollment in floriculture programs at universities. And the enrollment dropped. A lot of times those departments at universities were swallowed up, consolidated into larger plant science departments rather than horticulture specifically or floriculture. And that is the reason we have a shortage of growers today. That's stagnation. But there is good news, and that's why we're here today. The industry is growing again, it's getting more automated, and it's attracting young people. All that is happening for some fascinating reasons. And here to describe some of this good news is my colleague and my friend, Carmen Azzaretti, Engineering Operations Manager of REI. I wanted to have Carmen in front center in a webinar for a long time. She understands the data, engineering, and pays close attention to societal trends. Everywhere her and her partner have moved, they seem to instantly have friends and become involved in the community. And all these combinations of traits makes her a fascinating and insightful speaker, and everything she talks about she seems to be able to bring back to the CEA industry and resource efficiency. Carmen, can you introduce yourself to our listeners today?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I'm the Engineering and Operations Manager here at Resource Innovation Institute, and a huge nerd of all sorts of things. So, floriculture and just agriculture in general has definitely become one of those nerd things. So, I'm always looking to connect those different pieces together, and I'm so excited to dive into some of the juicy goodness of this report together.
Great. Why don't you bring up the next slide, and I'm gonna launch you into this. Before we get into all the weeds of the report, tell us where all the data came from that informed your report, what's in your report, who's it available to, and of course, what your goal is. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So, this report is thoughtfully compiled sections of the USDA Census of Agriculture. So earlier this year, they released their 2022 Census of Agriculture, which they do every 5 years. That report is free and available, and it is 800 pages of teeny tiny tables. So it is thick and dense and juicy, and you gotta sometimes dive down some rabbit holes to figure out what any of it actually means. So we went through that and we took out the sections that are specifically relevant to CEA. And we've compiled those into pages that are trying to put together a picture of different sections of the CEA industry. So this report covers covering types. It covers food versus floriculture within the CEA industry. It covers specific crops within food, specific crops within floriculture, and kind of that like big picture in greenhouse food, in floriculture grown under protection. And it also has a very, very intentional introduction section that talks all about where that information came from the USDA, how it was surveyed, what the response rate is, and kind of how all these things are captured, kind of frequently asked questions. So all of the information that goes into this report is free and available to the public, but this report, the full report, is available only to RII members and supporters. It will be available on August 6th. We do have a public preview that's coming out. So if someone's like not really sure, they can check out the public preview, which does a pretty good job of capturing what's in it. Now, something that I did very intentionally within this report is it's about 53 pages, and it is a dense 53 pages. So really, I tried to compile each page in a way that it could be kind of taken out of the rest of the report. So you could take the couple of tomato pages and you could go sit down with your team that's interested in tomatoes, and you could have a pretty good picture of the United States tomato market and the changes over the last 10 years and have a conversation about tomatoes. It's kind of designed so that things are thoughtfully compiled so that you have a good snapshot in this kind of 10-year history in this 2022 kind of moment. And so that's kind of what it's designed for.
That's great because I know that historically the USDA census it's not been used enough because people haven't been able to compile the data into reports targeted at certain sectors of the market like you've done. Let's get into it. Tell us a bit more about the data.
Yeah, so we're talking about floriculture today. This is all I want to talk about today is floriculture. So there are many ways in which floriculture is captured in the Ag Census. These are kind of your main ways that CEA floriculture is captured. So this is floriculture under glass or other protection. There's this total category that has its own numbers, and there's each of these subcategories: the bedding and garden plants, cut flowers and cut florist greens, indoor foliage plants, potted flowering plants, and then this kind of other category. So within those subcategories, some states will choose not to report data or not to have the data be included because they're protecting a business. So they'll put like a D, which means they're not disclosing it. So there's some states that will choose not to disclose some subcategories, but it might be included in the macro category of that total category. Also, there might be some, as we were talking, there might be some stacking or square footage that's kind of duplicated. So some of those area pieces might be kind of not adding perfectly, but it's a really good picture overall in each state for these specific categories. There's also like a nursery crop CEA category and a vegetable transplant CEA category and a couple of those ones that are around. But here we're just going to talk about this kind of macro set of categories that the USDA is kind of considering as your core CEA floriculture. Now, within this, there is a section that has the under protection area and operations, and then it has the not under protection area and operations. So here, these crops are not only grown in CEA environments. However, we're able to take that data that was specifically about CEA environments and report on it. So that's the number of operations and the area under protection for each of these. Now, that under protection could be anything from a plastic film kind of greenhouse to a high-tech glass or rigid plastic greenhouse, but we are talking about permanent structures. So this is not temporary structures. This is not the kind of hoop houses that get dragged around. It might be a hoop house, but it would be a permanent hoop house. And these plants are grown kind of throughout under that. And looking at a question here, so the 10-year change trends would, yes, be from 2012 to 2022. So the USDA Ag Census comes out every 5 years. So we looked 2 censuses back. And then each one is kind of published 2 years after the data is collected. So the data for 2022 is all collected in that calendar year of 2022. And then obviously it has to be sent, and then it has to be compiled, and then they have to make a report, and then we have to make a report. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. Any questions, Rob, or do you want me to dive in?
So just a comment. So you've not just taken a chunk out of the, you're not just taking a chunk out of the census and telling us about it. You had to tailor your report because CEA is different than floriculture in general. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we took a little slice over here, we took a little slice over here from the 10-year ago report and put them together so that we can really give a good picture of CEA that was able to be gleaned from the Census of Agriculture, as well as some from the specialty. There's a specialty horticultural census, the horticultural specialty crop census. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's another report that is more kind of
Yeah.
diving into specific crops within CEA, and that one should hopefully be published in about 2 years. And so we took a little bit of that out, just about covering types in this report also. So we have a little bit more of a picture of that, and that will be available in the main report. But this one is, yes, taking those little pieces, looking at the food, looking at the floriculture, looking at how those look together, and these little slices from those things. So this is all thoughtfully compiled so that it is digestible for people who did not spend hours and hours and hours learning what the heck is in this report.
Yeah, it's very clever. I've taken a look at the report from your drafts, and it is really, really useful, and the way it's been customized. Go on. Thanks for letting me ask that.
So let's talk about floriculture. So we're going to talk about total floriculture, then we'll dive into some of these subcategories. So again, the two kind of sections of information that's contained within the USDA Ag Census is always number of operations and area. Now, individually, those things are interesting, but if you put them together, I think they're even more interesting because you can kind of get an idea of how big operations are. Now, just because there's multiple operations doesn't necessarily mean there's multiple owners of those operations. So you could have like a large company that owns multiple operations, but it's also kind of more of an indicator of having a large company if you have less operations and more area, or a lot of smaller businesses if you have less area and more operations. So here we have stacked, and you can see kind of down the side there, those same floriculture categories, and you can see here kind of where they're falling. And so our largest states are kind of some of our typical ones that have been coming up throughout the report. So Florida coming in at the highest amount of operations and area, and then California right behind them. And then for area and for number of operations is kind of interesting and different here. So Texas coming in 4th for area, but they're somewhere more like 10th for number of operations. So Texas having maybe some larger operations, something like that. The data is presented in square footage within the report. So this is all going to be in square footage. Here you can see square footage down the side. So we can also talk about what people are growing. So if we look at Florida, Florida is interesting to me. It is the largest floriculture producer. It typically comes in like, top there. But what's kind of interesting also is the amount of space this bedding and garden plant, which is all kind of a lot of operations across the board. Some of these larger growers are growing less bedding and garden plants versus some of those states that aren't growing as much area are growing more of those bedding and garden plants. So here we see Florida, if we're looking at the area, we have a lot of cut flowers, we have a lot of foliage, which is really interesting. California also, I would expect more area to be in the bedding and garden plant. But here with California, we're really seeing, again, a lot of cut flowers. And then here we're seeing a lot of potted flowering plants as well. Rob, what are you seeing?
I was just fascinated by, you and I talked about this earlier about Florida and California having such a small bedding plant as a portion of their overall floriculture production. And we invite our listeners to correct us when we're just wrong or out of control. You know better than we'd love to hear from you. Carmen emphasized that to me as I was hosting this, is let's make sure people know they can tell us when we're wrong. But we feel like California and Florida cut flower production in greenhouse is just more energy efficient. So it makes sense they would have a great large portion of their production cut flowers, because you just don't have to heat as much and you don't have to light as much. But also bedding plants, I can't help but wonder if those two, California and Florida, I think Florida in particular, the landscaping industry probably doesn't need as many bedding plants and hanging baskets, because there's so many perennials that are flowering and blooming just all the time there. That's just a guess, but I just wanted to throw
And
out that comment.
they can be outside. There is a whole section of bedding and garden plants
Ah,
that are grown outside. So in places like Florida and California, they might have a lot of operations that are growing some amount of bedding and garden plants under protection, but they might be a really small area. So here you're seeing that they have those smaller areas because maybe they're dedicating more of their outside space. With floriculture, with bedding and garden plants, you have a lot of places that are growing outside and inside at the same time. So you might have some of that where they're like, oh, well, we have these ones that really want to be in the greenhouse, but the majority of our bedding and garden plants are outside, so they might be having operations that are growing them, but with CEA, but the CEA area is pretty small compared to the rest of what they've got going on. The other one that I think is always really interesting is as we look across these bars, we've got Hawaii. And Hawaii has so few of those bedding and garden plants. And we were
yeah.
talking about those probably being a lot of perennials in Hawaii, and then also probably being able to grow bedding and garden plants mostly outside in Hawaii. I mean, you're not really having as much of that annual, I think, thing in those types of climates. A lot of plants that might even be annuals in colder climates might be perennials in Hawaii. But Hawaii, that's looking like a ton of cut flowers. And that to me makes sense. And I think you see a lot of those cut flowers in those kind of high entertainment, tourism. People go there for weddings. People go there for big events. They are going to Florida, California, Hawaii. They're expecting like flowers. Hawaii, you're expecting tropical flowers. There's a lot of lay flowers that maybe could be grown in controlled environments, and maybe they're grown more in the off season in controlled environments. So those I think are really, really interesting ones as well.
Great points. Keep going.
Yeah, and I do want to address here, so Arizona right there, Arizona decided not to disclose a lot of their individual categories. So there we kind of stacked them where they would be from the total. But you can see there's a couple of places where if a state chooses not to disclose, and there are some states that choose not to disclose their area very much at all. Like North Dakota and South Dakota tend not to disclose a lot of their areas, so we're not really sure where they end up. But you can see there. So while the USDA data isn't perfect, and that is not 100% response rate, it is a pretty good picture of kind of what's going on in the states. So let's dive into some of these categories a little bit more. So let's look at these overall trends. Sorry, forgot what order the slides are in. So if we're looking at overall floriculture, so all your floriculture categories combined, looking at a 10-year trend from 2012 to 2022. There's some really interesting stuff in the area, I think, here. Specifically, Alabama and Arizona have a huge growth in the area from 2012 to 2022. That's looking like about 400 and 500% growth. Now, neither of them were kind of in that really top area as far as like all 50 states, but they are growing significantly. And those to me are really, really interesting. Rob, what do you think?
It's a head scratcher. And we would love to have someone from Arizona or Alabama. If you're on this or have friends there or colleagues, give us your opinions. Carmen, we do have a comment I want to throw in before we get too far along.
Yeah.
That for California, low bedding plant numbers might have to do with water conservation. Fascinating. Some parts of CEA, and this is from Lauren Morlino, who is a good friend of RII's. Some parts of California are too hot to grow many bedding plants outside without massive amounts of costly water. or growers may grow berries or other high revenue crops in their place. Thank you, Lauren. That was
Yeah,
wonderful.
thanks, Lauren. There's definitely a lot of dynamics going on, and I don't know the specifics of what's going on in each state. I don't know what's going on in Arizona. Looking at the map, though, I mean, Arizona has the ability to serve places like Las Vegas as well as LA and San Diego, kind of that Southern California area. So some of that floriculture growth might be to be able to serve those areas. And we were talking about California, we are talking about water. There might be some operations in California that either expanded to or moved to Arizona to still serve those Southern California areas with maybe less water restrictions. There might be more water restrictions going on in California, and it was maybe not as optimal for their floriculture operations, and maybe they're moving over the border towards Arizona. I'm not sure. But I think Arizona and having that floriculture industry booming clearly with growth, I think that there are some pieces there related to where you can easily serve from Arizona.
Yeah, without any data, that occurred to me too because we're hearing a lot of businesses, particularly right now from the cannabis industry, leaving California to go to other states or cutting back at California
Yeah.
just just because the regulations are too restrictive and they say they can't make a profit. So I couldn't help but wonder if regulations had a play in it, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely some relationships between um, different types of programs meant to help or tamp down or regulate or encourage food, cannabis, floriculture. I think there's a lot of those areas touching each other. So if there's a program that's designed to encourage food greenhouses, it might actually end up pulling up some floriculture greenhouses or encouraging some other things or just creating a better market or having better service in that area, which is really interesting. So the other one with this huge growth is Alabama. And originally I thought Alabama was really odd because it's so close to Florida. And then wouldn't it be competing with Florida? But I think it does make sense that there might be some businesses that are floriculture businesses in Florida that might be moving into Alabama, and then able to kind of expand their businesses into Alabama, especially as maybe we're having some more intense weather conditions in Florida.
Yeah.
That's my thought on Alabama. But if anyone has any better ideas about what's going on in Alabama floriculture, I'm very interested. Ooh, we've got Leslie said that cut flower production seemed to boom during the pandemic in Alabama. See, that's really interesting to me because we're going to talk about cut flowers. I'm really interested in what's going on with cut flowers. But before we move on to the individual categories, I do want to talk a little bit about some of these places where we see an expansion in one area and a reduction, or an expansion in operations and a reduction in area, or vice versa. So, like here we have Colorado had over 100% expansion in number of operations growing floriculture, but it looks like maybe a 30 or 40% reduction in the area. And that to me is very interesting. So that means there's more people growing floriculture, but there's less area in Colorado in that 10-year period, that change. Um, Granted, Colorado is a cannabis state. And if you start growing cannabis, your area is then taken out of the USDA Ag Census entirely. So that might be related to some changes in the cannabis industry, whether that is some big floriculture greenhouses going into cannabis and maybe some small greenhouses cropping up to fill some of those spaces, or maybe some small cannabis greenhouses coming out of the cannabis game and going into the floriculture game. But that to me is really, really very interesting. That's a pretty significant change on the left there from Colorado having over 100% growth in number of operations and then a 30 or 40% reduction in area.
And there's precedent for what you just described. Both in Canada and California, large floriculture operations were bought up and used for cannabis.
Yeah. So there's definitely some influence kind of around on that. Another one I think is really interesting is the number of operations increasing in Utah. Utah is not somewhere that I particularly think about for floriculture, but I do know that there's definitely a pretty significant kind of like Salt Lake City entertainment, wedding, like center of wealth. I know you've probably never seen The Real Housewives, but like there's some
No,
intense
I
Real
haven't.
Housewives energy in Salt Lake City. And they probably are doing a lot of landscaping and having a lot of parties with flowers. So that one's really interesting to me. There is still an expansion in the area, but you've got a lot of operations growing over there. Same with Nevada here. We have a growth in operations, a reduction in area. So there's a good number of those kind of sprinkled around. Um, and I just think it's fascinating. But let's talk about specific subcategories. What's growing and what's shrinking? Now, I think this is a very interesting chart. So this is nationwide in every single state, operations and area, what changed in those 10 years. Cut flowers. What the heck is going on with cut flowers here? Absolutely fascinating to me that we had an 80% increase nationwide in number of operations growing cut flowers, but then over a 30% decrease in area. Absolutely wild. What do you think, Rob?
Head scratcher for me. But I think there are some trends. I'm not sure if you want to talk about it now, but there's some trends that we definitely have read about and seen that might point to why you'd have a lot more smaller operations. And that would be specialty cut flowers that can't be shipped very well and don't have a long shelf life. And those two things are interconnected. And so a small grower could make a lot of money off of these flowers, such as sweet peas, for example. Sweet peas are very easy to grow in your garden, but they're not a very good flower to ship. And so that they're actually quite valuable to florists. They'll pay a lot of money. And so I can't help but wonder if there are a lot of people came out of the pandemic, and I'll let you talk about the pandemic. We're looking for a career change. Customers were interested in locally grown, sustainably grown cut flowers and specialty flowers because they were spend more time in their houses. But that's all I can guess at.
Yeah, to me, this cut flower screams pandemic. Like
Uh,
this changed the cut flower industry. I mean, you got to like mid 2020 and you're talking the entertainment industry is dead. There are no weddings. There are no big galas. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So I think there was some huge floriculture greenhouses that completely shifted what they were doing with that space, that moved completely away from cut flowers. And I think, like you were saying, I think that's those carnations, those roses, those big, big parties, those big, big entertainment. The entertainment industry is still trying to come back, and it's even 2 years after this survey was taken. So I think that cut flower industry took that huge hit, those big players in that cut flower industry. And then I think what you were saying related to wanting more novelty flowers, wanting weirder flowers, wanting in season, funkier, nicer smelling flowers. I think that that's where you're having those lots of smaller operations cropping up to serve their more local regions versus having those big, big flower companies shipping those shelf stable ones, those roses, those carnations, those like big, entertainment industry flowers. Also the wedding industry. And I'm seeing that Leslie Halleck is in here, like banging on my door about the wedding industry here. Yeah, the wedding industry changed. Like I'm 29. I am peak wedding industry right now at this point in my life. And I know a lot of people are
people,
scaling down.
okay, go.
They're using rented silk flowers or rented wooden flowers, or they're dyeing their own wooden flowers, or they're going with house plants as centerpieces and then only doing bouquets, but then they'll spend more on the bouquets. And the cost of weddings has exploded. And cut flowers are one of those places you can kind of cut down. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here.
Carmen, take a look at our question and answer. We've gotten some great responses to what you've just been talking about. I'll let you read those real quickly
Yeah.
to our
Yeah.
listeners.
So I'm seeing Lauren's here saying weddings are an all-time high. I agree, but I think they've changed. I think the way people are using flowers in their weddings have changed. And like I said, I think they're renting more stuff. I think they're doing more house plants, and I think that they're They're looking for that novelty. They're looking for those weird flowers that are funky and interesting and different and not something they see all the time. I don't think people are going for a full room of white roses. I don't think that's the trend now with weddings, which I think is just absolutely fascinating. And yeah, this data does end 2022. So since then, I'm not sure how this might have evolved. We might have seen some of that cut flower area come back, and maybe they are more regional. I don't know, but I just think the cut flowers are awesome. Do you want to look at some state-specific cut flower data?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think this is supporting a lot of what we're saying, where all across the country, except for here, Florida and Hawaii, are the only places that had a reduction in operations for cut flowers. And to
Incredible.
me, that says everywhere is doing more small scale local flowers for cut flowers. You had a reduction in some of those major spaces. Florida and Hawaii, I think, probably took a hit tourism wise. You probably had some change in number of operations there related to tourism, entertainment, or again, those large entertainment flowers. But every other state had a growth in number of operations. And I really think that's enforcing this idea that you have a lot more small scale growers growing funkier stuff. Granted, the teeny tiny growers are not captured in this survey. So I'll have to double check exactly what the cutoff is, but you have to be surveyed. And even if you could be surveyed, you have to be surveyed and then you have to respond. The response rate for this census is about 75%. So this is not everyone, and it probably misses out on the smallest of local growers, but I think this is really what we're seeing here. And maybe you have farms that grow food or they grow other type of floriculture that moved into growing a small amount of cut flowers because you had this vacuum after your your big growers post COVID were like, we're not selling hundreds of thousands of roses anymore. That wasn't something we could do for 2 years. We're going to cut out that area, and then you've got funkier stuff. But what do you see, Rob, in your local grocery stores these days? I'm
I
interested.
love my grocery store flower section. It's ridiculous. It used to be a joke 10 or 15 years ago, but now
Handful
I
of
go in there.
carnations and some roses, and that
Yeah,
was it.
exactly, exactly. And now they have my grocery store has someone who I know has horticulture training, that she's been working there for at least 10 years. And
Wow.
the selection is dynamite. I go in there every week, and it's like, wow, I've never seen anyone selling kale as a cut flower before.
I
Like,
don't think I've seen that one either, but I'm gonna have
who's
to
doing
check.
this? It's like and it just keeps happening over and over again. And before I forget, I'm also seeing the same thing online. That when I order flowers online, now I can go to some pretty elite services now that have dynamite cut flowers that you don't see when you just do the old kind of florist online shopping you used to do. I don't want to say names, but it's just like you can get the selection, like you said, is more, it's more broad, it's more weird, and I just love it.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing like I don't see that part of space. I'm not doing a lot of online flower ordering. Just a little bit, but I do remember like it used to be there were a couple of big websites and you would order through them and they would have your local florist do it and it was very middle of the road, standard, generic, kind of looked like you would imagine like in the background of a hospital room in like Grey's Anatomy. For some reason. That's like where my brain is going was like, oh yes, it's in like the smiley face mug or something. And yeah, I'm gonna have to go check that out now because that's awesome to have
And
like more interesting floriculture from the internet side because we can do
and
that now.
what you would see in the past was that the local florist was allowed to substitute. You'd see a pretty picture, but
Right.
if they didn't have that cool flower like delphinium, they would put something less, often it would be less unique in there. It'd be disappointing to me. Whereas the larger ones, if they don't have the flowers for that, they just say not available. So for me, that's been pretty that has improved
Interesting.
my customer satisfaction.
Yeah, and I like again, just Trader Joe's has been amazing for me. Like every time I go into Trader Joe's, I'm just like, these are phenomenal. As far as the cut flowers. But yeah, that online piece, I
Oh,
think there's so much more potential now for us to be able to direct around to these small florists that can then lean into what they're good at and what they have in season and what is local for them. Um, is just really awesome. Let's talk about area because
okay.
we haven't talked about area yet. Um, which again, I think it's so important to look at the area and the operations together because it says so much more. Alabama, again, absolutely wild. This, this, and so unfortunately, we can't standardize the scale very well, or else it wouldn't make any sense. Um, if you can see on the bottom there, that's like a 1,300% expansion in the area of cut flowers and cut florist greens in Alabama. Absolutely wild to me. Like that is a huge expansion in area. So that could be a couple of growers or operations growing more, adding more space. It could also be a whole bunch of them being added. But here you have what between like a 200%, about a 200% growth in the number of operations growing cut flowers in Alabama. So that to me says more than one operator is coming into Alabama, putting in a whole bunch of greenhouse space for cut flowers. And I don't know what's going on there. If someone has insight into what's going on in Alabama, but like Alabama is growing as far as cut flowers goes. And I just think that's so cool.
Yes, anyone from Alabama out there, please give us some
Right?
insight, or anyone from the South who might
Well,
have
because I
have
don't
an idea.
know. Like you've got Atlanta, you've got New Orleans that maybe could be served by Alabama, maybe Nashville. But I don't know where these cut flowers are going in Alabama. Granted, I mean, it could be that you had some of these big operators close somewhere else. Um, and you could be having some growth in Alabama for business reasons. Uh, Leslie mentioned lots of water folks. I'm not exactly sure what that might mean, but I'm just fascinated by the amount of impact that Alabama is having on the floriculture industry and growth in general. Now, if we looked at the top 10 states, Alabama wasn't really on there for most of them. But if you're looking at growth, like that's where a lot of growth is happening. And I think that's why the percent change and the current stats are both important together. Also Alaska on here. So here there's over a 400% growth in operations in Alaska growing cut flowers, and then there's over a 500% growth in area. That's really interesting to me. I have no idea what's going on in Alaska.
Me too. And as a reminder, this is a side note to our listeners that uh, because I kept making this mistake when I was talking to Carmen about this topic was I kept thinking about small U-pick farms, right? That's another trend in floriculture, but
Right.
that's not in this. That's not in this. We're talking CEA operations.
Hmm.
Cut flowers, in this case, grown under protection. So Alaska kind of reminds us that, yeah, you're not going to be able, you're going to have a short season up there and you're going to have difficulty growing in outdoors.
There are a lot of programs targeted, like USDA and otherwise, at Alaska having more greenhouses. So this might be kind of related to that, but there has to be this demand for cut flowers in order to be able to have this growth. And again, it's not just one big operator. You're talking a 400+% growth in number of operators. So you have a lot of operators in Alaska growing cut flowers. And like, has there been a big influx of people? Are people having weddings in Alaska? Like, is that something that started in 2022? Um, I'm not sure. All right, we've got Lauren has mentioned population growth in Utah, Alabama, and Colorado. They could be
Ah,
moving to these states, working their small pieces of land as compared to large existing growers who would have larger pieces of land. Definitely, definitely possible. I agree with that. Here again, we have this huge expansion in Utah too. So we have Utah and Oklahoma, Wyoming, Colorado. Those have all had over 400% growth in their number of cut flower operations. not as much growth on the area side, but to be fair, Vermont has like a 300 or 400% growth, but it doesn't look that big because if you compare it to Alabama's 1,300% growth, it doesn't look that much. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to see this evolution, and I think part of it is again like the closing of maybe some big players and greenhouses and the opening up of smaller, more specialty shops, or the transitioning into cut flowers, maybe more towards 2022 or 2021 that is serving that 2020 kind of vacuum that was left.
Right.
Uh,
Let me ask you another weird question. If a person wanted, you would think that if all these operations are opening up and they're not you pick farms, they're not outdoors.
mhm.
You would think, okay, then maybe there's been a an explosion of hoop houses being built and that are so it's crops under protection. Could someone go to that USDA census and see different types of facilities and how they've grown?
So not in the Census of Agriculture, which is this 2022 publication, but there is a 2019 and hopefully a what 2026, I hope, fingers crossed, Census of Horticultural Specialties. And the Census of Horticultural Specialties includes a table that has 3 different covering types. And we do include the 2019 data in our overall report because I think it's very important context. And it talks about flexible plastic coverings, rigid plastic coverings, and then glass coverings. Again, for permanent greenhouses. If there's flexible hoop houses being dragged around fields, I don't know anything about it. Neither does the USDA, that I know of. I don't know. They might have it somewhere else. Don't quote me on that one.
So we don't have
Um,
any post-COVID data for the types of,
no, we have
okay,
no post-COVID data on the types of coverings.
okay, thank
But I
you.
will say that coverings are about 75% flexible plastic, or as we're kind of referring to them as likely low tech,
Yeah,
because those flexible
polyhouses.
plastic coverings, maybe a fan, maybe a heater, unlikely to have supplemental lighting or advanced controls or HVAC systems. So, when we're talking about floriculture or food, and we're talking about CEA in the United States, we're talking 75% about low tech situations. Um, which I think are evenly spread pretty much between food and floriculture. I don't think we can lean one way or the other and say it's mostly one or the other. But yeah, those are the types of coverings. And so there's some interesting stuff. At the end of this year, the irrigation related census is going to come out, and there's some interesting information about different irrigation methods. And I'm hoping to be able to extrapolate their under protection irrigation methods into what percentage of these do we think have high-tech systems? So if there's a high-tech irrigation system, you're more likely to have a high-tech other system. And I want to do some extrapolation as to what we think the potential high-tech greenhouses are coming out of that irrigation um, census. So there's
Fascinating.
a handful of different censuses that are published throughout this 5-year period in between agriculture censuses. There's so much amazing, juicy data, and some of it is so very difficult to find.
Hey, we've got a questions from Leslie, and then I
Yeah.
want you to talk about houseplants because I that whole phenomenon is something
Oh,
that flew under my radar. Uh, Leslie asks, or makes this comment. I just think a lot of standard cut flower production has shifted to imports, and we know that Colombia, Guatemala. Uh,
okay.
Ship a lot of cut flowers into the US. So that I believe that's what she's referring to. She asked if there's any data in the US Census report on the imports that are coming in, or if this is
There's
just US
no
production.
data. It's all about US businesses. It's
Okay.
surveying, it's the Census of Agriculture, it's all surveying US agriculture. However, I am sure that somewhere, either in the USDA or a different government organization, is tracking imports and certain types of product imports. That definitely exists, but it is definitely not in this census.
Thank
So
you.
they being the government definitely has data on that. They being the USDA Ag Census definitely does not have data on that.
Very good. Thank you.
Now, yeah, let's talk about the other COVID thing that I think is absolutely fascinating. Uh, Indoor foliage plants. So indoor foliage plants are house plants. We're talking your monsteras, your pothos, your millennial Gen Z addiction coming out of COVID. And when I first mentioned this to Rob, you were like, what are you even talking about?
Yeah, I'd not heard of this at all.
And 2 years ago, I sat down and I showed you the insanity that was the cuttings on Etsy. And you could buy for like $300 a rooted cutting of like a Monstera with certain type of like white, what is it? There was a specific, it's like the elbow. There was some specific elbow white variegated Monstera thing that people were spending hundreds of dollars on cuttings off of Etsy. Like someone from Etsy was sending you a rooted bit of plant through the mail. And that in 2020 and 2021 was like huge. So huge growth in the floriculture industry. If you could look, you could scroll through like TikTok or Instagram and you could just look at houseplant content for actual days. You could just look through videos of people talking about houseplants, giving you tours of their houseplants, like the houseplant explosion within like people who never had any houseplants are now like filling their homes with houseplants. Millennials and Gen Z. And I know Rob, you were like, what are you even talking about? This is not your corner of the internet.
I
Uh,
know it's not. And Leslie asked, "Where have you been hiding, Rob?" And I'm about to tell her that my feed is full of ads about arthritis medicines and retirement communities, and I just did not see this. But it's a delight. I mean, there's always been a small sector of people who've gotten into this, but I didn't expect this to would ever explode like you're describing.
oh, it's huge. And so what I think happened here, and I want to see the 2024 data. I know we're never going to get to see the 2024 data unless it's in the specialty crop census. The specialty crop census, it might be 2025 data. 2024? I don't know. But I want to see how this continues to grow because 2022 was just when the like mainstream big box stores were catching up with this plant trend, like this house plant trend. So you have this number of operations that expanded 60% from 2012 to 2022. And I think that's people swapping over their space, maybe from cut flowers, I don't know, maybe, but like swapping over their space into growing these houseplants, uh, like that started, right? You had these small plant shops cropping up all over like every city. You had lots of sellers. There's like crazy carnivorous plants that you can now buy. And obviously those things are not being grown outside. Neither are any of these tropical houseplants. Like tropical houseplants are being grown pretty much inside most places. Um, but yeah, so you had that huge expansion, but your like Lowe's and your Home Depot and your like big box nursery type stores had not caught up, right? So whoever was distributing to those places, like you couldn't even buy like a nice Monstera in like 2022 at most of those big box stores most of the time. Like just a normal one without any kind of special irrigation, and people were trying to sell you those for like $200 at your specialty plant store. But the specialty plant stores were out in force in 2022. So I think now at 2024, you can buy that plant that people were spending $300 on a cutting for $40 at Lowe's and Home Depot and Trader Joe's, and it's like this big. So I think there's been a huge expansion in the area dedicated to these indoor foliage plants since 2022 even.
And they'd be easier. You wouldn't need a high-tech facility. It'd be easier to get into the market.
Yeah.
In fact, greenhouses typically have layered different plants because they know they can have their highlight plants in a hanging basket or on a table, but they put those house plants below the table even. There's a lot of tricks that
Yeah.
greenhouses can do.
So you could actually have the same area being used twice, and that's common.
Yes, yes, you would have layers in your really high production season, but in the season where there's no holiday coming up, you're not doing bedding plants. The
Okay.
greenhouse will tend to have house plants trying to have some form of income coming in.
Well, and there's no seasonality to houseplants. I mean, I
Right.
think there's seasonality to the bedding plants, there's seasonality to the cut flowers. Obviously, those potted flowering plants, I think, are again a lot of those like seasonal. You have like your poinsettias and like,
Yeah.
you have your what is it, Christmas cactuses and things like that.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's seasons to houseplants.
No, there isn't. And people, the holiday and seasonal flowering plants, of course, people love them because they're beautiful, but there's also a lot of guilt associated with throwing plants away. And
Yeah.
so they tend to see their poinsettias just dwindle and wither. And me as a greenhouse manager, I'd say, just throw the darn thing away. Here, I'll throw it away for you. Okay. You can buy another one next year. Don't feel guilty. But houseplants are not like that. It's a different relationship, particularly if you're at home working from home rather than being in an office. Would have a different relationship with your plants.
Yeah, I think it's very much that like we have been in our little home enclosures so much more, even post COVID, like we're more working from home. And like we want to decorate our enclosures. We're seeking to make our homes more comfortable. People are, leaning really into the DIY. You're probably not seeing as much of it. My feeds are like dogs and DIY and house plants and native pollinator gardens. Like that's another one that like the millennials, I don't think you're going to see it as much statistically, but I think that bedding and garden plant space is changing. The types of plants that people are asking for are changing to be more natives and more pollinator friendly type stuff. But I want to talk about um, where we think these foliage plants, these indoor foliage plants, are coming from. Now,
Good.
we talked about cut flowers. We talked about cut flowers leaning into things that aren't easy to ship and don't ship well. Tell me about shipping foliage plants.
I'm not an expert, but I don't think it other than the sheer size of them, you could not get a lot of them into a truck like you could the flowering
Okay.
crops that have these racks with multiple shelves and you can slide a bunch of bedding plant trays. You couldn't get as much on a truck, but they'd be much more rugged. They'd be much more shippable.
So that's interesting to me because what the heck is going on in Iowa? Like
Iowa.
2000% growth in the area dedicated to indoor foliage plants in Iowa. And like Virginia's there with like what, 1300 about? And like Virginia, you can serve the DC area. Like Virginia is making sense to me. I know that whole area. North Carolina is really growing in population. Those things make sense to me. What the heck is going on in Iowa?
It's almost like because when you told me this yesterday, I did some research. I couldn't figure out if there'd been any huge operations in floriculture that had moved into Iowa. I couldn't find it, but I didn't look for very long. It makes me wonder if these were floriculture that were growing flowering plants and got out of that market because they're responding to this demand
Maybe.
for house plants, and they kind of shifted their practice around their market, their product market.
Yeah, because Iowa, I mean, like, if I'm looking at Google Maps, there's like Chicago, Minneapolis, Kansas City. Like, there's not a lot of big population centers near Iowa, but again, we can ship them further. And I do want to quickly note here before we move on, we have North Dakota and South Dakota with huge expansions and operations, around 600% expansions. But if we look at area, they didn't disclose their area.
Hmm.
So it's not even that they didn't grow or shrink, it's that they chose not to disclose their area. And I know that can be sometimes hard to figure out on my charts, but so who knows what's actually going on in North Dakota, South Dakota? You could have one company that has tons of space
Yeah, yeah.
in North Dakota and South Dakota that has a whole bunch of operations. But again, it's 600% growth in operations, but they're choosing not to disclose it.
Is that
For
because they're trying to protect the identity of that operation?
typically, it's like it's similar how do we do it with Power Score, where you're like, oh well, if there's not that many operators, then we don't want to disclose their business information to each other. So that's typically how it goes. But I will say there's certain states that just like tend not to disclose. So I don't know who gets to decide whether or not they are not disclosing those, and exactly what the conditions are around it. That is not something I was able to find. Really, it just says like not disclosing basically to protect the interests of operators in those states. But yeah, I don't know what the heck's going on in North Dakota and South Dakota.
Yeah, and with the other thing we kicked around was maybe there were some extremely large distribution centers for,
Yeah.
say, Walmart in some of these states like Iowa, and I wasn't able to spend much time. I know the largest one for Walmart apparently is in Indiana. I didn't know that, but
Oh, interesting.
it could be there's some other logistical reason why Iowa.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I'm not sure. It's smack dab in the middle there. But,
yeah,
we're talking our population density is heavily Eastern time, and Iowa is firmly in the central time zone,
yeah,
leaning towards the mountain time, which has nobody there. I mean, what, less than 7% of the US population lives in mountain time. And so it goes like Eastern time, I think it's like 40% in Eastern time, and then it goes Western or Pacific, West Coast, and then your central. So yeah, I don't know about Iowa. Again, like Virginia having that 1300 expansion makes sense to me. Like I know I can see where I think Virginia is selling these house plants. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
I
Like,
agree.
you've got DC, you can even get into like Pennsylvania, New York. Like geographically, there's not that much spreading out. But I don't know. I don't know what's going
Yeah,
on in Iowa. Um, so I think we're getting to the end here.
I think we are. Tell them about when your report will be released.
Yeah. So the report will be released August 6th. I'm so excited. If you have questions about it after you've read it, send me an email. Brenda's gonna drop my email somewhere. Uh, yeah. Send me an email. I'm happy to chat with it. I'm happy to chat with members about it. Again, the full report will be exclusive to members and supporters. But there will be a public preview that has a lot of the explanation for where this data is um, in it, as well as just some really nice, juicy previews of what those pages look like. Again, this is just designed to be chopped up and brought to your team. Like, I want people to sit around a table looking at the cut flower pages and arguing about what the heck they think is going on in Iowa. And I want people to get sent down these rabbit holes so that they can really help inform their business strategy. This is a really excellent resource. The USDA Ag Census is an excellent resource, and what we've done is we have made it digestible for the CEA industry because it is a rough one to get through. But we made this digestible for the CEA industry, and I am so excited to bring this to our members and supporters.
Well, with that, we'll close out today. We want to thank Brennan McMillan for being our wizard behind the curtain today and helping us run this webinar. Thank you to Carmen Azzaretti for being our expert panel, and we thank you all for attending our webinar.